low-skill wage earners and geared their appeal accordingly. This is not what all political parties can do. And I would take it that there may be some parties that pursue an inbound strategy, that mediate group demands in order to find a pivotal position that allows them to gain bargaining power to make or break political coalitions. And these could be social democrats that typically seek their support in two of the groups, but as you know, these are in part pursuing conflictual interests. And also center-right parties that run under Christian democratic and other labels, depending on the country. Let me give you here, this is maybe sort of best for contentious reasoning. An idea of how this might shape up. So here we have the conflict about redistribution of those who are in the labor force, more or less redistribution. Here we have positions that are more for investment-oriented policies or more consumption-oriented policies. Here we have the outbound strategies of political parties. Here we have the inbound strategies. So social democracy, while in a system of product differentiation, could shrink to anywhere between 15 and 25%, depending on the country you're looking at. I think in Holland they're now down in the opinion polls below 15%. They may still be critical to deliver majorities that favor the social democratic idea. This has to be amended, of course. A lot depends on the orientation of the other players in the system. Libertarian left party strategists know very well that in order to gain more bargaining power, they have to be more than captives of bargaining strategies that are ultimately governed by social democrats. So they will try to move around social democrats and get other electorates. I need not tell anyone living in Germany and seeing what's going on in Baden-Württemberg with Pretschel. Oops. What happened? Even trickier might be what left parties are doing. In this model, they are the full entity that has to deal with people with orientations that support authoritarian governance and national homogeneity, among others. There may not be that many. I mean, this is not a this scheme here doesn't give you sort of a distribution of the population. I think there are relatively few down there, but it essentially demands. I mean, if you use German, the German party system, it demands from the left to play the role for the social democratic idea that the CSU has played for the CDU on the opposite side, to mop up people who otherwise might be difficult to integrate into a centrist strategy. And they might not play along with this. You see these conflicts. If you look at the German left party, think of Sarah Wagenknecht releasing trial balloons that gesture toward this, whereas the party elites are mostly up there. At the moment, a lot of the left party, I take it, electorate is supporting the party because of exogenous reasons that have to do with East German identity. But that will wear off increasingly and certainly generate some interesting strategic problems in the left. As far as social democrats go, and here we get to the question of the sacrifice. Let me deal more with the strategic problems that social democrats. Well, just one more thing. I mean, I devised this before the Berlin elections. If you think of Berlin is obviously an extreme outcome. But if you aggregate the Greens, the Linke, and the SPD, you get 56% of the vote. This is, I haven't checked the historical record, someone here in the room probably knows better. This is as good or better than anything that Willy Brandt, at the highest point of his success, as Lord Mayor of Berlin, achieved. So in that sense, if you say that all of these parties are roughly committed to the social democratic idea, there's still a lot of continuity. The same way at the federal level, the parties typically score between 40 and 45% of the vote. The absolute peak of social democracy in Germany in an election was in 1972. I think it was 44.5% or something like that. So we are still pretty close to the social democratic high water mark as it comes to the social democratic idea. We are nowhere near when it comes to the social democracy as a label. And that's sort of a hard fact that social democrats have to do. That is the strategic dilemma. And so how are social democrats dealing with this? If they propose an outbound strategy, they might squeeze competitors in their own sector. But they will lose the centrist vote. And as a consequence, they will lose bargaining power over policy and government coalitions. Just think of the coalitions between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats in the current federal government. I don't know whether I could quantify the score, but in my reading, Social Democrats clearly got the better of it in the coalition bargaining, whether they are credited with it or not. If Social Democrats pursue the inbound strategy, they will lose severely to the outbound left socialists and left libertarians. But they will gain critical voters in the center space. Moreover, as an added benefit, they have been able to externalize many of the intra-party conflicts they had in the 1960s and 70s. The Jusos are relatively tame by comparison to what they were like in the previous age. Because these young, ambitious politicians can go elsewhere. And most importantly, they salvage the element of the idea of social democracy if they become a pivot in policy formation. Let me, with a warning that I'll now give you a unidimensional simplification, give you a little game for social democrats to play. That actually, when I wrote this book in 1994, I had some bona fide social democratic politicians play. I didn't call it an experiment at the time, and I wasn't really doing it in a systematic way. But I essentially gave politicians the following payoff matrix. You have two parties in your sector. One, sort of the outbound party strategy, a specialized left party, and then the potentially inbound party strategy of the Social Democrats. So you have three positions, 1, 2, and 3, with scales of liberal to conservative in the American language, often are from 1 to 7. So you have here sort of between far left, left, and center left. And that gives you the electoral payoffs. If social democracy moves left, the combined share of the two parties will be substantially lower than if it moves center left. But center left is a hard to swallow strategy because it's not a vote maximizing strategy. In this system, of course, that would be a simple, if the vote maximization is the rule, the simple equilibrium would be here. The outbound specialized party moves left, and the inbound party moves left as well. So they get into each other's territory. But for the combined share, if they could coordinate, it would be much better if the Social Democrats sacrificed themselves and tried to capture, in a unidimensional model, the median voter and left a very large share to the more specialized political parties. In a number of countries, in Scandinavia and in Holland, this is already a reality. I think in Germany it's on the agenda. ignores a lot of things. Just to preempt the discussion about these things, we know that lots of voters are not responding to programmatic questions at all. And make it out that party strategy or the party electorates that the electorates that parties win is entirely a question of the programmatic appeal. But we know that that's not the case. There are lots of non-programmatic elements that affect party strategy. Moreover, I'm not saying, therefore, that this could really, this simple model could predict victory or defeat, given all the other vagaries of choice that affect any particular election. Nor do we know how outbound parties actually behave in this model. As already indicated to you, within the left party, there are lots of strategic dilemmas to consider. Same way within left libertarian parties. So this is a very dynamic system in which maybe only on average the result comes about that I sort of mapped here. Finally, I did not bring in any ethno-regional variants. I already indicated a little bit that the strategic dilemma I mapped here is not one that occurred in similar ways everywhere. I would nominate that in Scandinavia, it appeared first in the 1960s and 70s. In some ways, I would also add Italy here with the PS, the Socialist Party, although one would have to debate what to do with countries where the extreme left competitors during the Cold War were political parties that essentially questioned liberal democracy. Although for the Italian communists, starting in the late 50s, early 60s, one may no longer say that. In some ways it applies to the Fourth Republic, and maybe in France again since the 1990s, although there are institutional details in France that make it difficult to apply this model. Later it spread to the Low Countries, more recently Austria and Germany. Switzerland is a special case. I've just come from a 4.5-hour seminar. I don't remember now who said it, Tariq, that in Switzerland the Social Democrats have mostly sociocultural professionals as their electorate. Yeah, so I didn't want to say anything at the time, but in Switzerland the party was never close to occupying the center space, and it was almost costless to pursue this strategy. So let me conclude by, what about countries with majoritarian institutions? So majoritarian institutions as defined as plurality single-member district electoral systems. Again, that is not the French system. Duverger went at pains to say that Duverger's law only applies to plurality and not to two-round majority systems. So I'll leave out France here. And in parties that have a presidential executive, the only one that really meets both criteria among advanced post-industrial capitalism is the United States. Well, in these places, we have forced choice. There are two fixed alternatives. The cost of entry as a condition or as setting off this process of product differentiation. The cost of entry for new parties is very high. And the consequences is that if there are novel political economic developments, then as a consequence, societal preference configurations, we likely see only intermittent efforts to create so-called third parties. In the United States, they're called third parties. They're very difficult to institutionalize. You may have some limitational cases where actually this institutional setup itself is broken. The empirical reference point for this is New Zealand, which in 1993 abolished its plurality system and moved to a German-style PR system with a 5% threshold. And as you know, Britain, I wouldn't say came close, but at least it's something that came onto the agenda with the increasing difficulty of caging preferences in the two-party system. With these limitations, what's more likely is that we do not have product differentiation in the party spectrum, but what we have is that the unrepresented groups, outbound activists, enter the mainline parties and try to dominate them. And that, in one way or another, generates a logic of polarization. And I'll give you here just some names of candidates who were carried to the leadership of their parties based on this logic. Sometimes successful, like with Margaret Thatcher. Often unsuccessful. With this guy we don't know. Corbyn probably unsuccessful. And with Boris Johnson, no. So I think we have an institutionally induced very different dynamic to deal with the differentiation of political preferences. And within the systems that enforce choice, the distinct possibility that from the perspective of the centrist puddle of voters, a logic of polarization will prevail. I steal this from The Economist. 2 months ago, The Economist commissioned YouGov to map what the US Parliament would look like if there was a parliamentary system with multi-party entry option. And as you can tell, it wouldn't look that terribly much different from what you find in most West European countries. So you see, I mean, the populist spectrum is probably still a little larger, 26% of the vote, according to this. But it would be very much in line with what the Austrian FPÖ or the French Front National, and even some Scandinavian progress parties might hold. I'm not going into the details of their appeals, but they also meet this. So my conclusion, there isn't really any way back for Social Democrats to the glory days of the past as political parties. I think the differentiation of party labels against the backdrop of more complex preference profiles cannot be undone. And it is difficult to convey to Social Democratic supporters, and especially party members, activists, leaders, that the best role, at least from the vantage point of the social democratic idea, they might play is to be centrist mediators, to keep social democratic ideas alive, rather than to pivot to an outbound strategy. And there are plenty of outbound parties already, so there's no point of duplicating those. Thank you very much.
Herbert has given us a lot to think about. He was very nice and sent me the presentation beforehand, so I wouldn't have to respond to it completely off the cuff. But of course that implied a different kind of complication, which was that all my comments were prepared beforehand out of the more simple interpretation of what he was going to say, which was actually the presentation, rather than the much richer and complex spoken presentation he's given us. So let me just start by saying that the first thing that I did this morning before getting the flight was to get the transformation of European social democracy, because I thought it would be interesting to compare Herbert version 2016 with Herbert version sort of 1994. And I think that there is sort of a lot of overlap, but there are also some but there are also some interesting differences. And this again sort of made sort of a question of my own interpretation. But I think that sort of Herbert 2016 is more pessimistic than Herbert 1994. And what we have here in the presentation is this difficult sort of dilemma, sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Left parties are doomed to political decline in some way. Either they go outbound and lose power or lose influence over what happens, or they go inbound and essentially they sacrifice. They take some electoral laws for furthering some more general sort of set of policies for social democracy, which again sort of means that in some ways they have also lost. But in some ways, the interesting thing for me sort of rereading the 1994 book was to think sort of what has changed. And I think in many ways, many of the concerns in the presentation today were there in the book to begin with, and some things have changed. I think sort of the technological change, for example, challenge, is perhaps sort of much stronger now. But many of these concerns were there already. But the conclusion was much more positive. Let me just read a quote that I wrote from the book. The lessons drawn from successful social democratic adaptations show that despite far-reaching changes in the economies and societies of Western Europe, social democratic parties are not doomed to political decline. Their survival and political influence depend on the extent to which they overcome their entrenchment in working-class politics and bring together a new electoral coalition. So what has changed? I think that sort of in some ways, I think it's interesting for me to think why that sort of relatively positive interpretation of what now sort of under this framework I interpret as a sort of an outbound strategy was sort of a successful one then, but not successful or not so successful now. Sort of in terms of a second point, and I'll keep sort of my reactions very brief so that there is plenty of time for reactions from the audience. I think I actually agree with Herbert's argument about this tragedy of social democracy, about the electoral dilemma. I think that Johannes Lindahl and I have talked about it in the case of Sweden, I think in much more narrow terms, but very similar to the ones that Herbert has used in the presentation today. But I'm not sure about the idea that this idea of social democracy being promoted by a social democratic inbound strategy, right? So there is first sort of an electoral question, right? And I guess there is this sort of complicated electoral math that has to happen for this to make sense sort of electorally, in terms of gaining enough votes from moving to the center, from the inbound move, to somehow compensate, or compensate enough so that social democratic parties are still sort of able to influence policy. There is a workshop tomorrow that deals with some of the topics that we've been talking about today. I think there is the paper by Tarek and a co-author addressed this sort of very directly, and one of the things that I took away from reading that paper was that in fact this kind of electoral calculation may be not very sort of straightforward. Also, surely there is a cost to this social democratic idea for moving to the center, right? So it makes sense to think that moving to the center can produce some benefits, but surely that inbound movement can have consequences over the nature of policy, and therefore there is some sort of dilution of the policy or the idea itself in this sort of proposed solution for the electoral dilemma. And how much inbound, right? So if we think that perhaps sort of some of these right parties have been, in fact, moving to the right, there is a sort of a lot of room to move inbound, and particular points in that space in which, again, sort of the promotion of the social democratic idea will stop sort of sounding like social democratic policy at all. So I guess there is a strong agreement in terms of the sort of the recommendation to the left, both in the 1994 book and in the lecture today, and that is the inbound sort of strategy, which I think in some ways is this sort of rejection of the entrenchment of the working class that I sort of quoted before. But isn't in some ways sort of the inbounding of the 1990s and 2000s that one of the reasons for the existence of this dilemma in the present, right? Sort of some of these cases, what we saw in the 1990s and in the 2000s were left parties that moved to the center and therefore opened up for the competition of some of the parties that you have identified as now opposing and sort of complicating the electoral dilemma of the left because they're more effective at capturing sort of these voters. So it's not clear that how we can sort of put those two things together. Another of the papers being presented tomorrow by Christopher made me think also about this sort of uneasy kind of tension between talking about some of these factors as dimensions and talking about them as issues, as the paper does tomorrow. So is it dimensions or is it issues? When I think of the recent challenges for social democracy in some of these countries like Spain or the UK, the kinds of things that come up are crisis and austerity and Europe and immigration and ethno-regionalism. Do they coalesce into some sort of coherent dimension? Is not so clear. Perhaps there's also the temptation, and sort of this is sort of my final sort of thought in terms of the reactions. There is also the temptation to consider some of these issues, in fact, to be very connected with just the one sort of old economic dimension, right? Sort of whether we talk about crisis and austerity, or we talk about Europe, which again sort of electorally gets most traction in the UK, for example, when it's put together with the issues of services and the NHS, or whether we talk about, again, ethno-regionalism and how much support Labour has lost in Scotland, or how much support the PSOE has lost in Spain, in Catalonia. In the UK case, an argument could be made that this, of course, coincides with an SNP strategy of promoting sort of anti-austerity and very sort of clear sort of economic policies that perhaps are not so clearly promoted by the left. So do we need the extra dimensions, or are many of these things in fact sufficiently sort of interpretable through sort of a simple-minded sort of one-dimension kind of argument? And I'll stop there, and so that there's room for other comments. Herbert, do you want to briefly respond?
Well, I hesitated a little bit because how much time do we have? Another 25 minutes? Well, let me only say something in 2 minutes. Gee, I hadn't even thought that you might go back to my old book. I think I was much more optimistic about the sustainability of economic growth. So I think the choices have become much starker than I anticipated.